Hi, everyone. Today on the show, we've got Noam Chomsky and David Harvey. The topic of discussion is going to be capitalism, world economics, free speech, just in general. How do we, as societies, self-organize in the 21st century now? So we've had Noam on the show before. Welcome back. Glad to have you here.
Glad to be with you.
And David, this is your first time on the show. I just wanted to kind of have the viewers give them a little bit of a background. So, you know, I think I first heard of you when I was listening to this talk called Crises of Capitalism back in 2008. By the way, I lost your camera feed.
Yeah, I seem to have lost it too. I don't know what's going on, but
well, let's see if we can bring it back. 1 second. There we go. I think, yep, I see. There you are.
okay.
All right, perfect. So yeah, Crises of Capitalism was the way that I first heard about you. And I happen to go to CUNY as well, City University.
Yeah.
So, you know, at some point, but for mathematics. So what does it mean that, you know, you are a geographer economic geographer, and how do you, how do you research what you do? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and how do you?
Well, I guess I'm of an age where I don't particularly value disciplinary affiliations. I just do what I think is interesting and important to do. Yeah, my background was in geography, and of course, you know, the differential wealth of nations, to co-opt a title of Adam Smith, has been a part of what interests me. Uneven geographical development, why some parts of the world are so poor, why, you know, all those sorts of things. And I increasingly got into trying to understand all of this through the theoretical framework that Karl Marx laid out. So over the last 10 or 15 years, I've been trying to figure out the theory of capital and what capital does, why it does, why it gets into crises, and all the rest of it. So a lot of work has been going on in that vein. That's roughly where I'm at right now.
No, what about yourself? I mean, you've written books about this. What do you, just wanted to ask, what do you know about David's work? I know you've said before that you've been an admirer of his work as well. Just wanted to ask you what you think.
Oh, I followed, first of all, I'm glad to meet you finally. I've followed your work for a long time. Use it in class. Last couple of years, I've been co-teaching a class with a colleague of yours, a Marxist geographer, Mark Waterstone. You probably know him.
Yeah.
Your books are part of the background reading for the class, so it's a pleasure to see you firsthand, even if it's only virtual.
Right.
I'm glad to bring people together. I remember in 2020, I connected Andrew Yang and Noam Chomsky. Did Andrew Yang ever reach out to you, by the way, afterwards, or that meeting never happened?
So many things happen I can't recall, but I don't recall anything specific.
Yeah, well, my own background is, you know, I'm sort of a left libertarian. I think, as opposed to, say, someone who supports large government solutions. My background is I help to foster open source software to emerge as a sort of a gift economy. Things like Linux, Wikipedia, science, right? Open sharing of knowledge, which is arguably different than maybe workers taking over a factory. So I'm, you know, not call myself a Marxist, but I am left-leaning libertarian who wants to see societies flourish by having software to self-organize. I feel that, you know, a lot of the stuff we have is given to us from big tech, from on top, you know, whether it's the governments or the media. I know you wrote books about manufacturing consent. So I guess what I want to talk about in the first topic is like, what do you see as today's systems that can counteract what we currently have? What we currently have is Google, Facebook, the big tech. We also have big media, big banks, essentially these conglomerates that seem to be running on the profit motive and not necessarily taking into account the public good, perhaps. We're going to get into AI later, but given what we have today, maybe I want to start with you, David. What do you see as the alternatives by the people today, by the people and not just for the people? Do you see anything on the horizon?
Well, there are masses of things going on around the world where people are searching for alternative ways of living, alternative social relations, and I'm coming across them all of the time. The big problem, however, is that there is nothing so much as a good idea that capital can't co-opt. And I think, the early days of what you might call techno-utopianism, peer-to-peer computing, all those kinds of things, suggested that this was a fantastic technology that could allow for democratization. And of course, what's happened now is it's now become a vehicle for monopoly control, the platforms and all the rest of it, so that you feel that big capital has simply stepped in and taken it all over. So what was initially, to me, a liberatory possibility has now become a rather oppressive vehicle coming from big capital. So that's the problem, but that's long been a problem. Marx noted that about the fact that the new industries that were coming on board, the new technologies that were coming on board, were supposed to liberate the lives of labor. But in fact, what they were doing was making them more oppressive. So there's a long history of that within the history of capitalism. And unfortunately, we've repeated that history around this, all of this new information technology. And we're seeing the same thing with artificial intelligence as well.
And, in the recent news, Elon Musk took over Twitter. He got together some sovereign wealth funds as well, not just private investors,
Right.
but basically groups of people. And one thing that characterizes capitalism to me, vis-a-vis other things, we have Richard Wolff talking about socialism. And I agree with him that in a socialist situation, it's more democratic. Each person has one vote. Even the janitor could have a vote, let's say. With capitalism, it's one share, one vote. And so someone could have a lot of shares. And sometimes they sit on each other's boards, right? So Elon Musk here would get all the shares and control what goes on at Twitter. And you have here Mark Zuckerberg, who's for years, has been obviously the top dog, the leader of Facebook, and he can't be fired, meaning that, nominally the shareholders do have a share. However, it's arranged in such a way that there's no way that they can ever vote him out. And they have,
Right.
they've tried, there's no way that they can do it. So Noam, can you maybe talk about sort of the, as you could see, do you see any alternatives? Are there any I know there's Mondragon, like socialist cooperatives, and there's a REI here in the United States calls itself socialist. I know you're a big syndicalist. Have you seen any alternatives start to emerge, or is it pretty much on the same level as it's been for decades now?
Is that, couldn't quite follow, is that directed to me?
Yes, the question to you is, I know you've advocated for anarcho-syndicalism and other alternatives to these top-down corporations. And have you seen anything on that front in the world come together? I know there's Mondragon is a famous example, but besides that, what is there today?
Don is a famous example, but it's happening right now in the old Rust Belt in the United States. The Carl Perovitz and his New Systems project have been in the areas where the Clinton deindustrialization program, the neoliberal globalization programs designed to deindustrialize the United States and to free the flow of capital with investor rights agreements. There was an effort to, when US Steel decided to close the plants in Youngstown, the workers offered to buy it and run it by themselves. There was a court case, Stoughton Lind, labor activist and lawyer, ran it. They couldn't win the court case, but instead of giving up, what they started doing was establishing small worker-owned, worker-managed enterprises, which find their way into the new service economy that's being developed. It's been done with some success. There's now quite a few of them, hundreds, I think. This is an expanding, and there are many other similar efforts. It's one way to try to create the seeds of a real democratic society within the current highly undemocratic one, in which to try to move towards the economic democracy, which would be the basis for any functioning democratic society. And similar things are happening elsewhere. So, for example, in our counterpart in South America, the largest country there, Brazil, happens to be the home of the largest popular movement in the world, the landless workers movement, MST, in which landless workers take over unused land for themselves, for the poor, and they've been moving to set up cooperatives, commonly owned, commonly managed cooperatives, which also provide and integrate with the outside community, like a dairy cooperative and so on. They're now linking up with another major popular movement in Brazil, the homeless workers movement, huge, which takes over similarly unused residences, turns them into cooperatives run by homeless workers, now linking up with MST. That's another example. And there are many other things throughout the world. If you look at the activities of Via Campesina, the huge international peasant organization, also similar things happening. And we find these around the world. They're not at a scale which is challenging capitalist domination, which is now destroying us. I mean, it's the fact that capitalism is kind of a death sentence is sort of implicit in its nature, but it's now becoming extremely clear. You can just look at this morning's newspaper and read that Biden's opening up large parts of the Arctic to ConocoPhillips, planning oil production for decades ahead, which drives us far towards destruction.
One moment, when you said we all remember that Biden reversed Trump's move to open up the Arctic, but now you're saying that he clears the way for a new project, basically, some drilling in the Arctic.
And when you look at it closely, you see very clearly why capitalism is a death sentence. So read the description closely. Turns out that the Arctic, the area where they're opening up for oil production, is heating more rapidly, much more rapidly than other parts of the United States. So it's going, the Willow Project, which you're pointing to, is going to enhance the heating of the Arctic, which will have an effect, you go down to the bottom of the article, I think it's the one you're looking at,
Mhm.
it'll have the effect of opening up the permafrost to melting, and that'll make it impossible to
Right.
dig for oil. So what ConocoPhillips is proposing, which makes good sense from a capitalist point of view, insane from a human point of view, is they've developed a technique for cooling the permafrost to slow down its melting. It's actually discussed in the article you just had.
Do they try to raise the albedo in order to
get to the last paragraph? ConocoPhillips has discovered a way to, here, it's right here. ConocoPhillips plans to install chillers into the thawing permafrost to keep it solid enough to support the equipment to drill for oil, the burning of which will release carbon dioxides that will worsen the ice melts. That's the essence of capitalism in a paragraph. We will use our technological facility to maximize profit while destroying the earth and even ourselves in the long run. Capitalism gone totally berserk, but its essential properties brought out there very, very nicely in that one paragraph.
So let's talk about the negative externalities that are happen under capitalist development, because I'm not quite sure that Marxism or socialism necessarily presents a solution to that. And I want to, David, maybe you can kind of talk about it just really briefly. I want to say I'm a skeptic, where I think that government works together with industry and they distract the individual from systemic problems. I'll just give a few examples, and Noam gave the carbon example. That's definitely a huge one, and it's a huge systemic one. First of all, the processed foods and the GMO, the genetically modified plants, they put processed sugars and starches into everything. I'm talking about here in the United States. The government has high fructose corn syrup, but then they tell the individuals that they can diet and exercise their way to stop the obesity and the diabetes that has become more prevalent. Factory farming is another example where animals are raised by the billions in these appalling conditions. Not all types of animals, but many of these animals, they cut off the beaks of these chickens so they wouldn't peck each other. They live in their own feces. A lot of the time they're caged in ways that they can't even move. And again, it doesn't seem like the market system would be able to solve this, but the government has banned people from even filming these things. Plastic containers, companies have switched to metric tons of plastic. I remember Snapple used to be glass and now it's plastic. Certainly cheaper for the company, but it's non-biodegradable. And they don't seem to have an incentive to create biodegradable alternatives, again, because the individual is told that you can recycle your way out of it. And it turns out that recycling was mostly a sham. They shipped it off to China for many years. So everything where the individual is being told, in the factory farm example, being told you can eat, you could become a vegan, a vegetarian, you can choose the correct meat, you can choose to opt out of plastic, or maybe don't drive to work as much with fossil fuels. With vaccines, there were certainly a lot of encouragement for people to take the vaccine, but there was not a lot of encouragement for the manufacturers to update their vaccines, even though they had the technology with mRNA. Like they've done one for AIDS now. They have a vaccine for AIDS that's going through trials, and yet we are still using the vaccine from 2 years ago. Government is definitely working with industry at all of these things. To me, the fact that the individual is being told you can diet and exercise, you can recycle, you can, while these companies are putting out metric tons of plastic and burning, like we're talking about, it seems to me there's not a political will to hold these companies to account and get them to change. But there's certainly a lot of interesting domination of the individual. No plastic straws, no bags, no this, no that. But who's talking to the large companies? So David, what do you see? Do you see politically any, how will socialism or Marxism improve this? I mean, don't you just have a political class that's also unaccountable in a Marxist system?
Well, I mean, I don't recognize what a Marxist system is. I don't think such a thing exists. What Marx did was to provide an analysis of the contradictions of capital, which would explain why it is that those things which look good end up being bad. And this is what Marx does, so that we have to get out of this particular mode of production. And I think that this is very important in terms of how you frame our approach to the problems that now surround us. I mean, if there are problems, then you can find solutions. If you have contradictions, you can't solve a contradiction, you can only manage it. And there is a contradiction in everything you've talked about. You know, as individuals, we have, you know, so many billion people on planet Earth, and they need to live and they need to have sustenance and everything else. So there's no way in which you can feed that number of people without actually disturbing environmental aggregates, which means that there are always going to be contradictions of some kind, which you need to manage and you need to curb. And right now, we're not working with the and the solution lies in socialism or Marxism or anarchism or whatever. And that's the wrong way to look at it. The proper way to look at it is to say, what are the contradictions, the main contradictions right now in our society, and how do we deal with them? We've mentioned one of them, which is, you know, climate change, environmental degradation, the suicidal way in which we continue to utilize fossil fuels in the way we're doing it and the way in which we're treating. So we can look at that and say, look, we're not managing this contradiction between nature, if you like, and how human society is evolving. We're not managing it properly. How do we start, therefore, to manage it in a new kind of way? And that then leads to the question of the kind of social organization that can manage it. I thoroughly agree, I suspect, with both of you, that the capitalist state is foundational for the reproduction of a capitalist system. Therefore, the contemporary state is, in effect, part of the capitalist enemy. And then the question arises, are there forms of governance, are there forms of association of workers, are there forms of association of populations, are there organizations of what I would call emancipated laborers who are willing to go out there and really change the world to manage the contradictions which exist in a different kind of way. So those are the sorts of things that interest me, and I look at things like the attempts in Rojava to work with assembly type democracy, to develop new democratic configurations. And I think there are many people in the world who are struggling with how to do that. We see a kind of some attempt to if you like, dismantle those aspects of the state apparatus, particularly the military aspects. And that is one of the things that concerns me a great deal. I came to my political consciousness in the time of the campaign against nuclear disarmament in Britain in the 1950s, 1960s. And one of the things I'm concerned about right now is that why is there no massive campaign about nuclear disarmament right now? Because we are on the brink of a potential confrontation of nuclear confrontation in Ukraine, and there too we have a great deal of work to do to try to get out of that mess right now. I mean, I've been an enemy entirely all of my life of NATO. I've always thought of it as an egregious, militaristic, aggressive organization, and now it's fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. And this is the kind of thing that needs an anti-war movement of significant dimensions of the sort that did exist in the 1950s and 1960s and did have some impact in curbing the militarism that was dominating in the world.
So that's interesting. I wasn't going to get into the war in Ukraine at all because I thought I didn't know what your views were, David. And I wanted to keep it to economics, but since you did mention a nuclear, you know, the risk of nuclear war, I think it seems that all of us here are in agreement, because I know Noam's views on this, and of course, you know, Noam happens to be a big critic of the United States, that he lives here, lives in the United States. I'm currently traveling. I disagree with Noam on one thing. I think that we should be criticizing the most egregious violators first. However, it happens to be in many cases that the United States is both the most egregious violator and the place where we live. So, you know, we happen de facto to agree. But I just wanted to say that others, like the Pope, there are many leftists. I remember that came out against the NATO summit. Actually, I was just in Spain, and in fact, in Madrid is where the summit took place earlier. Many people came out, and this is in the countries which support the continuation of the conflict. When I say continuation, just to be clear, I mean, I think there is a diplomatic solution. There is a way to return to the table and involve the people on the ground, asking them, what would you like? Elon Musk, who is not a politician, literally proposed something like this. He proposed asking the people, you know, of the Donbass region, but I would also say to the people of Chechnya, ask them if they want to be part of the Russian Federation. Now, it turns out we did ask people, let's say in Spain, where, for example, Catalonia, you know, we did ask people referendum, and they in fact said in 2017 that they would like to secede. There's also there's another referendum was done that same year of the Kurds referendum, sorry, 2017, whether they would like to secede from Iraq. You can imagine, even though they said they did, the neighboring countries, including Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey and others, did not take kindly to this. So asking the people what they want would seem to be what democracy is all about. And it would put an end to these large organizations, let's call them countries, okay, you know, who want to own these people or own the land. And it's largely a war of territory, in my opinion. So I'm just putting out my opinion, but I'm saying that never mind China, India, where billions of people live, and then we have Brazil and world leaders and the Pope. I am saying in the countries that support not having a diplomatic solution, and I would put Russia in that list, because I think the government of Russia has not been engaging in good faith. The United States government hasn't been engaging in good faith, and many of the Ukrainian leaders haven't been. So I blame all the governments, but I'm saying the people of the country seem to, many of them, be calling for coming back to the negotiating table. Noam, what do you have to say about the risk of nuclear war in this particular engagement? And if Russia's backed into a corner, do you think it's likely they'll escalate this to the nuclear option? Or what do you think of this, the Ukrainian war at this point?
You raised quite a lot of questions, going back to the original one where you talked about our disagreement. It isn't stated quite properly. There is a moral principle which I think we should adhere to, and that is our energy and efforts should focus on what can do most good. That has nothing to do with that. It's a simple elementary moral principle. So if Russians say a US out of Iraq, it's okay, but it's of no particular interest. If Americans say to Russia out of Ukraine, again, no particular interest. What's of interest is what we can influence and affect. that we understand that very well with regard to enemies. So, for example, we honor and respect Russian dissidents who condemn the policies of their own country. We don't care one way or another what they say about the United States, of no interest. And that general principle, we should be honest enough to apply it to ourselves. Well, take the question of everyone's in favor of saying, yes, people should decide. Do we know it? Are they in a position to decide? Not very well. So let's take Ukraine. There are Gallup polls in Ukraine, Western Gallup polls, which show that a large percentage of the population, maybe 75%, wants to continue to carry through and expand the war. On the other hand, if you take a look at those same polls in the conflicted areas, the areas where conflict is going on, turns out they're pretty split. Almost half want to move towards a diplomatic settlement. Well, now I'm concerned with the United States, and I should be, because that's what we can influence and affect. We can affect the fact that the United States has been taking a position which undermines the possibility of a diplomatic settlement. And I'm concerned with that and have been for several years. I think we should move away from the position which is undermining the prospects of a possible diplomatic settlement, which might end these horrors before they come worse. And it's pretty easy to see. No, these are not the Crimean referendum. That's something different. These are Gallup polls taken inside Ukraine, all of Ukraine. They were recently discussed in an article by Jonathan Steele, which you can probably find somewhere. He ran through the polling results, very good British correspondent. I think it's the one on October 18th. It's not him, but
right. I do want to weigh in and just say that I have
Steele's article. The U.S. position is the formal position is the war must be fought in order to severely weaken Russia. That's the official U.S. position. Okay. Yeah, that's down the bottom there. Probably it. It's about
right. It
split.
says here, support for continuing to fight is stronger in regions farthest from the war, of course.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
now, can we do anything about that? Well, we could. For example, we can affect U.S. policy, which is insisting on continuing the war in order to severely weaken Russia, and that means whatever happens to Ukrainians, whatever happens to the people starving around the world who can't get food from the bread basket, one of the bread baskets of the world, what happens to all of us if it moves up the escalation ladder to possible terminal war, as it might. Well, we can do something about that. We can help. We can eliminate the barrier to negotiations, and it's a very explicit one. Like last March, Ukraine and Russia, under Turkish auspices, were negotiating. Britain and the United States moved directly to inform Ukrainian government that we were not interested in negotiations at this time. Boris Johnson flew to Ukraine, in fact, followed by Lloyd Austin, U.S. Defense Secretary. We know there's very little coverage here, but we know from Ukrainian sources, Ukrainian press, that they made it clear to the Ukrainian government that this was not a good time for negotiations. Have to keep fighting the war. Well, I think that's a very harmful position. I think we ought to be removing barriers to negotiations. Whether there are possible diplomatic settlements is not clear, but the only way you can find out is by trying. if you block the opportunity to try, you can't do it. When you say nobody's Russia, United States are not acting in good faith, that's almost a tautology. You don't expect great powers to act in good faith. What you ask is how you can influence their actions. For us, that means, of course, primarily the United States. We can't influence the actions of Russia, but and there are things we can do, like we can again eliminate the barriers we're posing to a diplomatic settlement, which could end the horrors before they get worse, and they are very likely to get worse. Now we're sending tanks. Next on the line is advanced aircraft. That's very likely to lead to a Russian reaction to the sources of supply. Could involve Poland, and pretty soon you're involved in great power conflicts, which can easily get out of control. So the primary victims of all of this are Ukrainians. They're suffering very severely, huge load. The Russians have not carried out a US, British, Israel style of war. In fact, US leaders are quite surprised that Russia has not done what we and our allies usually do, go straight for the jugular, ensure the energy system, transportation, communications, shock and awe, make sure that the country can't function. Actually, they are now beginning to do that after months following the US-UK position, and that Ukrainians are the main victims. Up to them with whether they want to continue is up to them, not up to me. But at least we can stop eliminating, we can stop setting barriers to a negotiated settlement, which might put an end to the horrors before they get far worse for Ukraine and much worse for the rest of the world.
So I agree with everything you're saying, that definitely the big losers as the war continues is Ukrainian civilians. I think it's very telling that the people closest to the region where the war is happening, no one talks about how much smaller the majority is to continue to support the war. I have developers in Ukraine, and obviously it's affected them, it's affected their families. But I want to talk a little bit more broadly, about the governments versus what the people do and the governments do. The incentive of the government leaders seems to be very different. They don't pay the price. It used to be that the king rode into battle with the army, and you could respect that. But today, the negotiations are optional because the king or the president on either side is not going to get even close to the activities. They can have a photo op, perhaps. So this guy here on Facebook, when everything started back in February, I quickly asked my developers if they could put me in touch with the negotiators on the Ukrainian side, because there was an opportunity to end the conflict through negotiation. I'm not going to go into the details, but I showed him on his own page. It's in Russian. Many of the people writing here, because many Ukrainians speak Russian, please make a deal. I don't believe that you are really trying. These are presumably Ukrainian citizens here, really concerned about it. Well, this specific guy, he got famous for wearing a hat during negotiations because he said that he didn't respect the negotiations. But I think also from the Russian side, there was not a lot of flexibility. And it seems to me that that these governments had so many chances in the Normandy format to get something done, and they haven't for years. They didn't get the agreements in Minsk completed. They met in Normandy, they met in Paris. They met multiple times. Every time it was Putin on the Russian side. It was changing roster of people on the other countries, but they never got it done. So my question is more about the people versus the governments. You know, if you ask about Crimea, they wanted sovereignty. They wanted their own country. A small majority voted to be part of Ukraine. And so to me, it seems all these groups simply want to be left alone and to live their lives in relative safety and prosperity. And yet these big powers, as you say, their job is to prevent war, but it seems that they fail. And so we have these leaders in charge, but the inmates are running the asylum, if you pardon the analogy. So David, I think there's a big difference between my generation or the people now, let's say the millennials and the Gen Zs and everybody. There is no fear of a nuclear war the way that there used to be with duck and cover and fallout shelters being built. No one builds fallout shelters in buildings anymore. The thinking is that, look, no one's crazy enough to start a nuclear war. What do you think about that? I mean, in this environment, are the politicians different? Is the public different? Like, what are the chances of a nuclear war given that nobody seems to really worry about it anymore, you know?
Well, let me throw into the argument a particular perspective, which links together, if you like, what the states are doing and what capital is doing. In 1950, the total output of goods and services in the world was around $9 trillion. In constant dollars, it's now about $100 trillion. In other words, you got more than a tenfold increase over the last 70 years. One of the things Marx talks about is, well, when capital is very good at producing surpluses, and then it's got its problem of how to dispose of surpluses. And I want to point to two ways in which the surplus has been absorbed since 1950 or so. One of them is through militarism. And I think this is terribly important right now, because every time Biden says they're giving $40 billion to Ukraine, in fact, they're giving $30 billion to the US defense industries to make all of those things that are going to be destroyed down there. And Marx kind of says, well, militarism and war is a great way to get rid of surplus. It's like tipping excess value into the ocean. And actually, when you look back, you kind of say, how much of the sustaining of a capitalist economy since 1945 has been built around militarism of various kinds? And if there's militarism, there's going to be a lobby in favor of militarism. So one of the things that's happening, I'm sure, inside of the Biden administration, as many of the defense contractors are saying, we'll give you lots and lots of money to continue this policy. So militarism is one of them. The other one, which is interesting to me, is urbanization. Look at the crazy urbanization in the Gulf states. Some of the crazy stuff going on in New York, where you're building, you know, more and more high towers for the ultra rich in a city which has a crisis of affordable housing. I mean, these two themes since 1945 have been foundational, and the state has been obviously deeply implicated in both of them. And this means that when you get conflicts coming, as we see in Ukraine, yeah, they want to destroy Russian military capacity, as the Pentagon guys kind of say. They want to do that. But at the same time, they also want to channel loads and loads of money to Raytheon and McDonnell Douglas and all the rest of it. I mean, this is a bonanza for them. They're loving it. And so then there's one of the big questions to point this out and to say that this is an incredible waste of magnificent resources. And a lot of this waste is about actually polluting the planet at the same time. So actually, when you kind of look at this and say, well, you know, this is the history of capital since 1950. A large chunk of it has been given over to mindless urbanization, stupid urbanization, and wasteful military conflicts, and a defense industry that is very much about, you know, high technology. And a lot of the technological fight that's going on now between the United States and China and all the rest of it has a lot to do with military capacity. So again, the interstate system is set up in such a way as to create competition between elements within it, and that competition leads into new technologies of war. So what we have is an economic system which is deeply implanted into a political system, and it is therefore wrong to say, well, the economy is over there and politics is over there. No, they are very much in bed with each other. And actually, if you look at the situation and you look at something like Ukraine, you kind of say, well, behind all of this, yes, there's a lot of questions about who has the right to decide what to do with, you know, in Ukraine. But behind it, there lie these very powerful vested interests who have a great vested interest in the continuation of the war and the continuation of huge amounts of resources being allocated to the wartime economy, and the huge allocation of expense of capital, which is going on in terms of what I would call mindless urbanization, signs of which we see all around us on a daily basis.
I've lost you.
Yeah.
Oh, I am so sorry. I have myself muted. I was going to say we have time for one more back and forth with each of you. And I just want to emphasize that, like, we live in countries, okay? Countries is the unit that we have today. There used to be empires, there used to be city-states. That's what we have today, the nation state. And, you know, the UN is composed of countries, and the delegates represent the countries. And so the countries are what we have. And if there's a referendum for independence from Spain or Russia, or indeed Ukraine or anything, they're not going to recognize it in the quote unquote international system. And so the people's self-determination is not necessarily the biggest factor anymore in these things. And so as a mathematician, you know, to me, there's a discontinuity. And when there's a discontinuity, there's a chance for war, because it's either option A or option B. The fact is, you know, as a libertarian, I would say there's so many options. You know, Russian companies could work on fixing the potholes in the roads, and then Ukrainian utilities can bring the water to Crimea. There's no real need to bundle all those under one flag and then fight to decide which country is going to own the territory. That's, in my opinion, the idea of a flag or a country is just one of many possible things that we should be concerned about, others being the food, the family, the culture, the resources, and so on. So to me, it seems to have become this like monolith. And China, David, to your point, China has also undergone tremendous urbanization. Ghost cities, as they called them, were centrally planned. Millions of miles of roads have been centrally planned. In my opinion, successfully. The cities have been settled. The roads have, you know, carried more and more traffic, and they're building more. So to me, the issue isn't anymore central planning versus a free market. The issue to me is that these large governments don't seem to be very sensitive to the needs. And indeed, in China, right, they're not very sensitive to the Uyghurs and their religion or any other religion, pretty much, including, I'm sure, ancient Chinese religion. Falun Dafa, Falun Gong, is a persecuted sect. Millions of people who have not done any terrorist acts at all. They'd have done self-immolation, I think is the biggest thing that they've done. But they've always been said that the Chinese government persecutes them. And of course, in Tibet, there's people who want independence. I mean, it's all over the map. Here in the United States, what we've done in Haiti, what we've done in other countries is just ridiculous when you read about it. So I'm just saying, given that we have countries, do you think we need another paradigm? Do you think we need to empower smaller communities like cities or indeed townships or something in order to self-organize themselves? And maybe the media too, because I don't see large governments providing the kind of thing, you know, that will solve it. I mean, just if you look at Haiti, the United States occupation of Haiti, which I'm sure Noam could say so much about. I mean, it was literal slavery. We rewrote their constitution. We imposed everything on them for years. And that's just one example. I mean, so Noam, like maybe 1 or 2 minutes, and then David, I would like to hear from you. Can the solutions come top down from governments, or do they have to start to become bottom up? And if they're bottom up, I think we need software. I think we need something to organize people that we currently didn't have. Noam, what are your thoughts?
Mine?
Yes, I know you have the transcription.
Sorry. Well, we could think of all kind of beautiful ways in which the world can be organized, but we live in this world, and we have to ask how we can hope to change it and improve it. One, we can think of many things that we can do. For example, we can build locally with self-government, self-organized communities, control their own affairs, workplaces. It's a crucial element. Workplaces owned and controlled by their people who work there. They can integrate with one another, lead to broader associations. You could imagine a real democratic society developing that way on left libertarian grounds that have been well explored. But while we can easily talk about it, we have to ask what we can do about it. And we can do the kinds of things that we've both been discussing, things like worker-managed industries, locally organized communities, pressures on the governments that exist, and which are, as David pointed out, virtually indistinguishable from concentrations of capital. They're not antagonistic. Basically, the governments are enormously under the control of concentrations of private capital. So we can pressure them in many ways to act in a manner that's more committed to human needs rather than to massive profits and capital accumulation. It's kind of striking that if you take a look at executive offices today and you think about Ukraine, they're euphoric. Major sectors of US economy, concentrated economy, are literally euphoric. The whole fossil fuel system, which includes banks, financial institutions, lenders, and so on, profits booming, fossil fuel companies, profits booming, military industry booming. Lockheed Martin, its stocks have been moving to the sky. The government itself, the military component of the government, is very happy about the fact that there's been much discussion of this, that with a very small percentage of the US military budget, we are severely degrading at the cost over the lives of Ukrainians. We're severely degrading our one military enemy, namely the Soviet Union, much weaker, but of course a military opponent, all on the cheap. Geopoliticians are delighted that the idea of an independent Eurasia, common European home, has declined. In fact, Western Europe is being driven more deeply under US control, issue that goes back to the end of the Second World War. So there's plenty of pressure within the US power system to follow the policy of maintaining the war in Ukraine, to severely weaken Russia, drive Europe into our pocket, enrich power systems in the United States, not Americans, because taxpayer pays for it. All of these are pressures that do exist, and we should be aware of them and being trying to confront them in any way that we can.
Yeah, I mean, we try, but what way can we do it? I mean, Noam, you have been publishing books for decades, and it seems that the world is ever more ruled top down. But at the same time, there have been technology has liberated people, given them personal computers, personal printers, personal blogs, and so on. I'm a big believer that technology can help liberate people as well as empower governments, but it can help people to self-organize where previously they were not able to. David, what are your thoughts? I'm sorry, guys. I think we're going to have to reconvene. Hopefully this is interesting, because I would love to have a longer discussion next time. Yeah, David, can you tell us what do you think the role of technology is in all this? Or what do you think?
One of the things that really bothers me right now is the sheer increase in the scale of everything. And you think of computers, and you're kind of saying they're liberatory and all the rest of it. And then you look at what goes on inside of computers, and you say, well, actually, one of the things we're looking at are computer chips. Now, it turns out there's a monopoly, pretty much, or oligopoly in the production of computer chips. There are about 3 really big producers. To set up a computer chip factory these days takes upfront capital of around $2 billion. And, you know, it's not as if somebody in a back, you know, in a garage can kind of set up a new thing like happened in Silicon Valley. You're now talking about mobilizing $2 billion to set up a chip factory somewhere. And there, like I say, there are about 3 of them. And the United States is now trying to stop, you know, Intel and everybody else selling chips to the Huawei and so on. So there's a big conflict going on around the production of these what you're referring to as a liberatory situation. And that conflict is about monopoly control. And the monopoly control in the chip making, and it turns out there's only one factory that makes the machines that make the chips, and that's in Holland. And you're kind of going, this is an astonishing concentration, a huge concentration of economic and political and also geopolitical power. And what we're seeing is a struggle going on. The Biden administration trying to decentralize the Taiwanese chip maker and get them to put plants in Arizona and things like that. So this is the world we live in. Capital has gone to a scale which is almost unthinkable in terms of contrary political organization. I don't see how the world can organize around those 3 massive computer chip makers, and who have all of the technology, which is actually then dispersed in the ways you account. So this is the contradiction, if you like, a huge concentration at one end and decentralization of everything at the other end. And then you kind of say you can't start by thinking about liberation just in terms of the decentralization. You have to think about liberation in terms of what the hell is going on in those major corporations which are making the chips, which makes the computers, which make for the decentralized possibilities which you're talking about. So those are the issues which concern me.
Very much. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you. I have another talk coming up.
That's good. I was going to say, Noam Chomsky, David Harvey, I know you guys are both busy, and thank you for coming on the show. And hopefully we can pick up this conversation and have another hour sometime in the future, because I think these topics, I think we just scratched the surface on all of this. Yes. So definitely, I hope you guys can come back. David, it was very good to have you.
Thank you. And good. And Noam, it's great to be in contact with you.